Let me ask you about a different matter, and that is the role, the influence of Dominic Cummings in Downing Street during 2020. Again, the inquiry has heard a lot of evidence about what he did. We've heard from him himself, of course. Various people have described his influence, his decisions. What was your impression of him, and what's your understanding of the role he played in decision-making in the early months of the pandemic?
You may need to unpack this into slightly more closed questions, otherwise I'll end up rambling on. But let me give you my headline view. First of all, I think the big challenge in number 10 is having a chief of staff who does the organisational structural role, which is, if you think how precious every minute of a Prime Minister's time, and we all accept that it is finite, how you organise that time authoritatively. Because everyone, you could, 10 times as many people want to see the Prime Minister or want that part of his or her time than is physically possible. That's a really important role. I think under Boris Johnson, Eddie Lister wasn't in there as a chief of staff, but as a sort of eminence grise, a wise pair of hands. I thought he had the right skill set for that. In terms of Dominic Cummings, that's not why he was there, whatever the title. He was there, it was to drive forward delivery, and also I think, and he was certainly well disposed to this, and I think well suited to this, try and amidst the daily hustle and bustle of events brought up by the media or whatever was the issue of the day, take a half step back and try and look strategically. And I think that was the intention of his role. And I also thought, you'll come on to this, you'll need to ask me, but in terms of diagnosis, I mean, quite a few of the things that he diagnosed that were wrong, I think he was right about. And actually the pandemic was a proving ground for some of those things, like data in Whitehall, for example, like accountability in relation to the brilliant civil servants that we have. I won't delve in too much that until you lead me there, but equally, I was 6 years civil servant as a Foreign Office lawyer, and I have very fond memories not only of my time as a civil servant, but also the professionalism there. So you're not talking to someone who's down on the civil service by design. And what you're looking for, in my view, and I think SPADs, including the most senior ones like Dominic Cummings, you're looking to try and form this synergy between the role the civil servants play, candor advice, sense checking, and fundamentally executing policy, and ministerial accountability to the public for those decisions. I don't think any government gets this perfectly, but what you're looking for is that synthesis. SPADs and Dom Cummings, in particular, are there for that, and I think that is critical.
Mr. Raab, that's an answer about what they might have been there for in principle. Can you help us with your experience of Mr. Cummings in practice? Let me read you one sentence of Mr. Javid's witness statement. He said this: "I felt that the elected Prime Minister was not in charge of what was happening in his name and was largely content with Mr. Cummings running the government." Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. But let me just say at the outset, and I don't say this as any disparagement on this committee or this inquiry, but there's a whole circus that can be built up in the media and elsewhere around the internal battles between individuals. And some of that is natural and healthy. You have tensions between civil servants and SPADs, between all of those and ministers, and of course between ministers. I, by the way, worked very closely with Javid. In fact, I worked for him when I was housing minister. I like him, I respect him. I think he's a great operator and decision maker in the way we were just describing. So I got no beef with Mr. Javid. But equally, I don't think that's quite right. I think Dominic Cummings, certainly on diagnosis, but also in trying to galvanise direction of travel, was much needed, some grit in the oyster. I think if you look at some of the things he said, we may come on to this, but the obvious one I think of is the osmosis between professions from outside of government in government. Funnily enough, Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance are great examples of this. I mean, when we came on to the vaccine trials and all the rest of it, having someone who has not only been a scientist, who knows how government works, but also been in a major multinational, taking a drug from trials to commercialisation, I mean, it's just gold dust. I think Chris Whitty was superb as well. And one of the things I think Dom Cummings had noted and observed is sometimes Whitehall can feel a bit like a closed shop. So I want to give you a sense of which I think he correctly identified some of the structural challenges without getting into the he said, she said, frankly, soap opera of Westminster bubble politics. The broader question you raised about whether Boris Johnson was a puppet, I'm afraid I don't find that a serious allegation. I think Boris Johnson certainly relied on his key advisors. By the way, I think you have to, if you're going to get through the work, particularly in a pandemic. I don't think, looking back at prime ministers past or present, if I look at Theresa May, or if I look at Tony Blair, the role of his chief of staff, his director of communications, it is natural. And if you present me something in a specific scenario, I'm happy to comment on it. But and Boris, just like anyone else who occupies that incredible role, and I feel some empathy with anyone who's done the job of Prime Minister, because I covered it for a month, and I think that made me a better Secretary of State because I could see quite what the pressures were the Prime Minister has to deal with. But you've constantly got this challenge of wanting to control the levers that affect government policy, but also knowing that to run an effective government, you need to delegate. And of course, you should delegate fundamentally through your secretaries of state and your ministers, but you also delegate with advice and reliance on your special advisors, just as you do through senior members of the civil service. That is natural and proper, and I just don't accept the characterisation that there was some sort of puppet regime.
Yes. You also detail, Mr. Raab, that of the 2 Cobra meetings that took place during January that we have heard some detail about, you didn't attend the first meeting. You sent one of your ministers to attend that meeting, but you did attend the second meeting on the 29th of January. Now, I want to move just a week or so forward in the chronology, because the inquiry has heard evidence about a meeting that took place on the 4th of February between the Prime Minister and Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer. This wasn't a meeting, as far as we know, that you were at. You may not have heard anything about it. That's one of the questions I'm going to ask you. But what we've heard is that, first of all, this was the first time that Chris Whitty briefed the Prime Minister relating to COVID, and that, in summary, what Chris Whitty told the Prime Minister was that there was a reasonable chance that there would be a pandemic in this country involving between 100,000 and 300,000 deaths if the COVID-19, which was then in China, spread internationally and became a pandemic. And we've heard from Chris Whitty that range, the 100,000 to 300,000, was not intended, nor was it presented to the Prime Minister as a sort of formal, reasonable worst-case scenario. They were intended as an indication of the seriousness of the situation if a pandemic of this new infection were to emerge. Now, I'm sure you'll agree with me, first of all, that was a very grave piece of advice that Chris Whitty was giving to the Prime Minister.
Of course it is, yes.
May I ask whether you were aware of that meeting or what it was that Chris Whitty had conveyed to the Prime Minister at it?
I can't recollect, but it's not remotely unusual that I wouldn't have been at that meeting. No,
I'm not suggesting it was. I simply want to understand whether you were or whether you'd understood it at the time. Let's go, if we may, to paragraph 58 of your witness statement on page 18. You describe there that, in fact, on the day of that meeting, you went on a pre-arranged trip, undertaking your official duties as Foreign Secretary to Australia, Japan, Singapore and Malaysia, and you were gone for about a week, as we can see there. And I think it's also right to say that later in February, after your return from that trip, you went on a family holiday or a personal trip skiing. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that is correct. I mean, in fairness, if you're taking the whole chronology, I mean, and this is the life of any modern foreign secretary. I was in Brussels first week of January, in the US and Canada the second, third week or around the same time I'm in Paris.
Yeah, I'm just going to interrupt you, Mr. Raab, because we have got limited time. We have your
but I think it's
statement.
important because I think I know where you're going with this. If I may, just to very briefly say, I went to Australia, Japan, Singapore and Malaysia, vital countries for the UK's foreign policy, and as it turned out, the relationships that we needed to service during COVID. And again, first week of March, I was back on the road to Oman, Istanbul and Saudi. That is the job of any modern foreign secretary.
Don't worry, I don't think Mr O'Connor's going to suggest you're on jollies, Mr Raab.
Glad to hear it.
Just wait for the question and then he'll make it clear.
The question I want to ask you, Mr. Raab, focuses on this time in February, where, as we've seen, first of all, you did this official tour to Australia and to those other countries. And secondly, after you got back, as I think you've agreed, went on a family holiday. What we can read into that, alongside the fact that at the beginning of that month, the Prime Minister had been told of this grave news about the COVID pandemic, which one might have thought, and certainly with hindsight now we can perhaps see, demanded a considerable upgrading of the government's response. Were you aware at that time of anyone suggesting to you either that it might not have been a good idea for you to leave the country, that you were needed, perhaps in your role as First Secretary, to be involved in work towards preparing for the pandemic, or that it wouldn't be advisable for you to take a holiday during that period?
So, 3 points. First of all, of course, the advice that you cite from Professor Whitty to the Prime Minister was hedged with all sorts of caveats and uncertainty. And as a common theme of the pandemic, we had potential scenarios with evidence which was hedged. And I think at a range of moments, and you'll have to ask the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, I'm sure you will, where you've got formative evidence coming through, which is still being tested, and at what point you make a go, no-go decision on whatever decision that may be. So, I think when I've looked at the minutes from the meeting that you referred to with the Prime Minister, I think it's hedged with, again, all those caveats and uncertainties. So I think, first of all, we need to understand that you take the decision when you've got sufficient evidence, and indeed when the CMO advises sufficient evidence to take actionable decisions. In terms of my travel, just to be really clear, of course, right the way through the pandemic, if it was either unwise, unsafe, for COVID reasons to leave, I would have been umbilically linked to the CMO in terms of chains of communication, and we would have been advised. I was not advised not to go. Indeed, it, I think, was very important, both for relations with all of these countries and the relations that we would have to tap, whether it was for PPE, whether it was on vaccine discussions or whatever it may be, that we did have those relations, particularly, as I say, with the likes of Australia, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, but also, frankly, all of them. In relation to the week away, as you can, I think, see from the chronology, being Foreign Secretary is a pretty gruelling agenda, and that comes with the territory. But equally, you will have noticed, and I'm sure you've got and seen and digested, the FCDO corporate chronology that was sent on the 23rd of December 2022, which details, and I'm very happy to go through it in laborious detail if it's helpful, but tell me if it isn't, all of the decisions, the communications and the meetings that I conducted during the February half-term, which you referred to, when I was away. Again, whether you're away on very rare leave that you get as Foreign Secretary, or whether it's because you're travelling on business and you need to stay in touch with what's going on in Westminster, I mean, that's just bread and butter. But at all moments, when I was needed, I was there, and certainly directing what my department needed to do if it wasn't easily delegated, which again, you need to do during a pandemic and actually in terms of business as usual.
Mr. Raab, one of the questions that this inquiry will have to consider is whether that month of February was spent properly by the government, not on business as usual, but on understanding and preparing its response to the COVID pandemic. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, do you think that enough was done during February, both by you and others, or not?
Yes, but look, as you say, it's with the benefit of hindsight. The reality is, at all moments, we're looking for enough evidence and credible, decisive, persuasive, overwhelming evidence, not just strands of evidence here or there, not just theses which haven't probably been tested, but conclusive evidence on which you can act. It's actionable evidence. And ultimately, we had to rely on the advisors for that. Now, a whole range of contingency planning was underway. But one of the things that was important is that the government didn't seize up, paralysed, because we could see evolving a pandemic or an emergency, whether it was limited to China, engulfing the world to the extent that it affected the UK. We needed to try and function as best we could whilst preparing for that. But again, you come back to the same point. Contingency planning without knowing with sufficient evidence what the threat was, you just end up rewriting it. And I think one of the things that I learned during this process is that when it comes to plans during a crisis, it's probably true in wartime, but that's not my experience in terms of direct wartime for the UK, and certainly in an emergency like a pandemic, is you need to try and stay in what I call perpetual beta. I don't know whether you're familiar with the phrase, but if you're testing a drug or technology, the last test you do before you put it to market is with real-time users. So you have your plan, but you're constantly testing and reiterating and refining the prototype. I think we and Whitehall needs to get much, much better at that. And curiously, one of the people that warned most about that, and I don't need to be the apologist for Dominic Cummings, was Mr. Cummings. I think your broader point, though, was, in retrospect, was February a decisive month? I think it was. But you can see that in hindsight. And it was the tipping point where we really learnt more sufficiently about the pandemic to tip the balance into, OK, well, now we've at least got enough evidence to take some actionable decisions. And I think that's the conclusion I came to.
Well, Mr. Raab, we can all think of our own management speak to describe these indications, but are you really saying...
So with the greatest respect, it's not management speak, it's science. And the people that have looked at, for example, forecasting, people have looked at why decisions get made that are wrong, both in government and outside. People like Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize. So not just management speak in the pejorative terms. People like Philip Tetlock, who have looked at how you improve, would say you need to strike this balance between moving forward and making decisions and, if you like, digesting the evidence. So I think it's... by the way, if it comes to a piece of learning for this inquiry about how government works, I think it is probably the single most important thing. And I don't think you should be quite so dismissive, if I may say so with respect, as management speak. I'm trying to give you a thoughtful, considered answer about how government works.
Can I ask you a direct question, Mr. Raab? Are you telling the inquiry that at the beginning of February, the government had inadequate evidence with which to take further steps that it could and should have taken?
So when we constantly peppered Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance with these kind of questions, and then there was frustration with the science itself, not just the evidence we were getting or the propositions we were getting, but and I think I had a long conversation with both Chris and Patrick, who I think very usefully said, well, you know, you can't think of the science as something which is decisive and then set in stone, which is why I come on to the perpetual beta point. It is something constantly being tested. And the point I'm making is I don't think we had a definitive enough answer about what the pandemic was doing, the rate at which it was spreading, what it would mean for the UK, let alone the other knock-on questions that inevitably need to be asked, which is what does that mean for the NHS, in particular ventilator beds and ICU? And also another big question, how long can you credibly stay in lockdown in a liberal democracy like the UK. So I think what I'm trying to help you with is that I'm sure with the benefit of hindsight, if we took a decision on, whatever date it was, you can always ask, weren't you versed enough a day before to take that decision? That's the luxury of hindsight. I think we genuinely tried to move decisively at the point at which the evidence was compelling, and we wouldn't then just be buffeted between competing evidence that would show up the next day or the next week. And that's the balance.
Mr O'Connor, we're going to pause there.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you.